So recall that we were examining bones from two perspectives. The first was as a tissue. The second was by studying the individual bones that compose the skeleton. So we have covered bony tissue in a previous lecture, so now we will examine whole bones in this segment. So bones of the human body are quite variable in their size. The smallest bones of the skeleton are found in the middle ear, and they function to connect the eardrum, which is the tympanic membrane, to the sensory structure of the ear, called the cochlea. The longest bones of the human body are the femurs, which are around 2 feet in length. And these are the bones that connect the hip bones to the leg bones and form both the hip and the knee joints. So bones can be categorized by their shape, and the study of anatomy recognizes 4 different bone shapes. We have short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, and also long bones. So short bones are cube-shaped bones, so that is, their length and their width are generally equal to one another. Short bones are primarily located in the carpal or tarsal regions. The carpal region refers to the wrist, and it contains the carpal bones, and the tarsal region refers to the ankle, and it contains the tarsal bones. Sesamoid bones are special short bones that develop within some of the body's tendons. The patella at the front of the knee joint is one prominent example of a sesamoid bone. So sesamoid bones generally function to increase the leverage of that tendon across a joint, but also they function to protect tendons across joints as well. Next we have the flat bones, and flat bones are thin bones that can sometimes be curved or have a curvature to them. The sternum and the ribs are examples of flat bones. The scapulae, which are the bones that compose the shoulder blades, are also classified as flat bones. And many of the cranial bones that surround and protect the brain, like the frontal bone, the parietal bone, and the temporal bone, are classified as flat bones as well. The irregular bones have shapes that are not easily classifiable. So the vertebrae of the vertebral column and some of the cranial and facial bones of the skull, such as this example here on the right, which is the sphenoid bone, which is a bone of the cranium, are classified as irregular bones because of their very unusual shapes. And finally we have the long bones, and they are named because they are typically longer than they are wide and are found in the upper or lower limbs. So for instance, the femur, which is the bone that's found within the thigh, the tibia and the fibula, that are the bones that compose the 2 parallel bones in the leg, and the radius and the ulna, which are the bones of the forearm and the antebrachium. These are all examples of long bones. Even the bones of the palms, which are called the metacarpals, and the bones of the fingers, which are collectively called the phalanges, are all examples of long bones as well. So now that we've examined the bone shapes, let's take a look at the structure of a typical bone, and the bone that we'll use as our reference is a long bone. So long bones have 2 expanded ends that are called epiphyses. The epiphyses have a shell of compact bone around their external or superficial surface, and internally are filled with spongy bone. The short, flat, and irregular bones generally resemble the epiphyses of long bones in that they have a shell of compact bone around their external surface, and then are typically filled with spongy bone. So specifically for long bones, since long bones are found in the limbs, one of the epiphyses is proximally located and the other one is distally located. So the bone that's shown in this example is a humerus, so the proximal epiphysis would be located at the shoulder joint, so it forms part of the connection to the, or part of the joint that is shared with the scapula, the shoulder blade. Meanwhile, the distal epiphysis is found at the elbow joint. The diaphysis is a tube-like portion of the long bone that serves to connect the two epiphyses to one another. The walls of the diaphysis are typically thickened, and generally they're mostly constructed from compact bone, and usually there's very little spongy bone that is found within the interior of the diaphysis. The interiors of the epiphyses usually contain spongy bone, while the interior of the diaphysis, as I mentioned previously, contains very little spongy bone. The interior of the diaphysis contains a cavity that's called the medullary cavity, which typically contains yellow bone marrow. Although in this diagram most of that yellow marrow has been removed so that the cavity is more easily seen. The epiphyses of long bones, as I mentioned, are typically associated with joints that connect to other bones. Each epiphysis is capped with a thin layer of hyaline cartilage on it to protect the ends of the long bone, as well as reduce friction when the bones move at that particular joint. These thin caps of hyaline cartilage are referred to as articular cartilage. As mentioned previously, the diaphysis of long bones contains a cavity that's called the medullary cavity. This cavity is filled with yellow bone marrow, which is primarily composed of adipose tissue. Bones are also very well vascularized, and there are small openings, small passageways in the diaphysis of long bones that are called the nutrient foramen, or if we're referring to multiple of them, they are the nutrient foramina, that allow arteries and veins to pass into or out of the bone. The red bone marrow is the marrow that is responsible for producing all of the blood cells, and it does so in a process called hematopoiesis. Red marrow is typically found in between the spongy bone of places like the skull bones, the rib bones and the sternum, as well as the vertebrae and even the pelvic bones. Returning to the exterior of bone tissue, we see that the bones contain or possess a connective tissue covering or sheet over them that's called the periosteum. And the periosteum is a thin, white-colored membrane that covers the superficial surface of all of the bones, not just the long bones that are shown in this example here. The only thing it does not cover are the surfaces of the joints that unite the bones. The periosteum primarily contains a lot of dense, irregular connective tissue, which provides a nice solid anchoring point for things like tendons, ligaments, blood vessels, and nerves. The perforating fibers are bundles of collagen that extend into the bone tissue itself. That is, they penetrate into the compact bone and anchor the periosteum to the surface of the bone tissue. The endosteum is a delicate membrane that lines the inner surface of the bone, and this membrane is primarily where bone growth, repair, and remodeling will occur. And last, we see that the external surface or external surfaces of bones are not smooth and featureless. So instead they have very distinct structures on them that serve as sites of muscle attachment or ligament attachment. They serve as structures that form parts of joints. They also serve as structures that allow for the passageway of blood vessels or nerves into or out of that bone. And as we work through the bones of the skeleton, we will see these terms being used in the names of specific structures on those bones.